and welcome to the 8th episode of Highlander, the show where we talk about every single legendary card in Hearthstone. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend and co-host, Jamie. How are you doing, Jamie?
Good, thanks, James. Hi, everybody.
I'm James, telling you to sit back and relax as we talk about some more cards. Dr. Boom. 7 mana, 7/7 neutral legendary. Battle Cry. Summon 2 1/1 Boombots. Warning. Boombots may explode. And for the record, Boombots are 1 mana 1/1 minions that have a death rattle of deal 1 to 4 damage to a random enemy. Jamie, where do we start with Dr. Boom?
It's the first question everybody who thinks about going into Wild asks is, does Dr. Boom still see play? I remember that card. Well.
This is a card with a reputation, shall we say.
Dr. Boom rotated out immediately before I started playing properly, so I didn't actually experience what went on. But when Dr. Boom was in Standard, it was in pretty much every deck. And that's not really an overstatement, because like a 7 mana for a 9/9 split across 3 bodies with extra damage, so it's sticky. That really kind of warped the format.
Here are some of the other 7 drops that were in the format at the time. Are you ready for this? War Golem, Ravenholt Assassin, Rend Blackhand, Corehound, Stormwind Champion, Troggzor the Earthinator, Gazlowe, Neptulon.
Flame Leviathan.
Nowadays, we've got much more powerful 7 and 8 mana cards, but at this point in time, that slot in a mid-range deck where you're looking to try and find these cards that you're going to top the curve out with, so maybe like Ragnaros, Dr. Boom, there aren't too many of them, but they are an extremely important card to have in the deck. So Dr. Boom makes it into almost every deck, because a lot of the decks at this point are this sort of mid-rangey deck, right?
It's a card that isn't sort of super out of place now, and that's what makes you realise how out of whack it is for the first pack expansion of the game. It caused every deck to run Big Game Hunter, which at that point was a 3 mana 4/2 Battle Cry, destroy a minion with 7 or more attack. And it ended up getting so bad that we've spoken briefly about this before, that playing cards with stats below 7 attack ended up being like a big bonus because it didn't get hit by Big Game Hunter. Big Game Hunter ended up getting nerfed because it was in every deck. And so Dr. Boom got a card nerf, which I don't think you can say for many cards, really.
I've got this very handy article in front of me, and they're talking about the competition in the 7-drop. We got a quote from then senior game designer Mike Dunay. This is the reasoning behind him not being nerfed, despite making an appearance in apparently over 90% of competitive decks. And the full quote is this: "We're keeping an eye on him, but I'm pretty happy with the fact that people are playing a 7-drop even in the rush decks. There hasn't been a 7-cost minion that's been playable for a long time, maybe ever. So I'm totally fine with people playing Dr. Boom. I would like to see more variety in the 7-drops, like if he was a class card and other classes had different 7-drop minions, I'd slightly prefer that, but that comes with time and new cards being released. He's very strong though. He's an awesome card." Interesting, looking at that in hindsight, right?
Yeah. Don't think it would have survived in the current climate, but then again, it's actually a really interesting comparison if you look at the current 7-drop slot. And honestly, I think it gets pretty outmatched by most of them. The most common and powerful 7-drop you'll find on ladder is Militia. That card kind of tramples Dr. Boom. So for reference, Sociologist Militia is a 7 mana 5/5 battle cry for each soul fragment in your deck. Summon a 3/3 soul with rush. In the deck that Sociologist Militia is most played in, i.e. Soul Fragment Demon Hunter, the cards that shuffle soul fragments in are so flexible and good that you'll often have 5, at least 4, I would say, soul fragments in your deck, which means that I would say you're pretty much always looking at a 17/17, of which 12/12 has rush.
Absolutely. And it's not like you have to run bad cards to do so. Like, for example, a 1 mana 1/3 that shuffles 2 into your deck is good, right?
Yeah, massively. Sociologist is a card that you get a benefit off of by just playing good cards. So this isn't about that card, but it serves to illustrate that the current best 7-drop is far better than Dr. Boom. And then you've got, obviously, Blastmaster Boom, deck building requirements, but that's just better than the normal one.
Well, exactly. Do you know that there's been some power creep when you're playing Bomb Warrior and you go to play Blastmaster Boom and you realise, there's only 2 bombs on my opponent's deck, so I can only summon 4 boom bots. It's what a low roll.
I see people say, if Dr. Boom was back in standard, it'd be broke and this and that, blah, 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 blah. And it's just, that's a load of rubbish.
This all falls in line with their philosophy, as I've said, of once there was one quite powerful 7-drop in a world where there really wasn't any others, versus now where there's quite a lot of powerful 7-drops.
Everything's got so much more synergistic now. Back then you could just play good cards because they were good and had decent stat lines. And Dr. Boom's kind of the king of good stat lines that are just like a decent board presence. But, we're past the point of piloted Shredder being insanely broken, right?
The sort of modern equivalent that I can think of, which is just a pile of stats that doesn't particularly synergize with the board, is something like Jandis Barov, right? 5 cost, summons a bunch of stats. That's kind of the closest you'll get to Boom, in my opinion, of like a card that doesn't really require any synergy in your deck and it just summons a bunch of stats. But the difference is that it's much more efficient than Dr. Boom, which is saying something, and it also comes down 2 turns earlier.
The main thing is that it comes down on 5.
The difference between a card dropped on 5 and 7 is significant, right? Because it's like, as you start to look at the stats to mana ratio of cards, you see on like 1 mana, a 2/2 is very good. So like a Blazing Battle Mage, right? On 2, your premium stats are like a 2/3 or a 3/2. On 3, you've got like your spider tanks at 3/4s and such like. But once you get to about 6 or 7 mana and upwards, things start to become a bit weird, because you've then got to consider, well, if I just play this card and my opponent just completely ignores it, then I just die, right? So whereas once you could just get away with playing Dr. Boom on 7 and your opponent probably wouldn't be in enough of an advantaged board state that they could, just ignore it. Paying 7 mana for something in Wild is a lot. If you're paying 7 mana for something, it really has to like win the game or do something absolutely insanely overpowered and silly, right? And Boom doesn't really do that. It does something very efficient that doesn't require synergies with the other cards in your deck, but you don't really want that. You want more powerful stuff.
It's something that I've said a lot in these episodes, is that it doesn't do anything when you play it.
We should get that on a t-shirt.
Mate, no, I mean, I know it sounds stupid. It's his Dr. Boom we're talking about. It's like the most notorious card in the game, but...
Oh, yeah.
Nowadays, when you're on 7, it doesn't do anything. Militia clears everything and puts stats in play. When I say think it doesn't do anything, that particularly becomes apparent at like 6 and above, I would say. Like you said with Jandis, 5 mana, you can kind of get away with it.
Speaking of mid-range, should we talk about Wild?
Yep.
All right. So when the standard Wild split happened in early 2016, I think a lot of people, and quite rightly, thought that the format was just standard, but with Sludge Belchers, Piloted Shredders, and Dr. Boom. And they'd be right. But as time's gone on, you very, very quickly see this change in deck building, right? As more people get drawn to Wild, as the format becomes more popular, as more cards are released, that enables some synergies, some powerful synergies. If we look at like the very first Vicious Syndicate Data Reaper report, which is June of 2017.
Yeah.
Now they're talking about how while a lot of people still think it's Dr. Boom and Shredders and Sludge Belchers, the reality couldn't be much more different. Dr. Boom does show up in the occasional deck. It shows up in Mid-Range Hunter, it shows up in Secret Paladin, it shows up in Mid-Range Paladin, but it's nowhere near as ubiquitous as it once was. And even then, it's still kind of the weaker card in those decks that it appears in, because a lot of the other cards are just relying on synergies, and this is just a good card to fill a slot.
I think that's about as much play as it saw, really.
And that's it, yeah. Its usage has only decreased because stronger cards that more strongly benefit a deck's game plan, even if like on paper it's slightly weaker than Dr. Boom, a lot of the time it turns out in practice, well, decks are often greater than the sum of their parts. The last time that I can remember people seriously running Dr. Boom was like in Witchwood Odd Rogue, right?
That's the last time I saw it. It will occasionally crop up in Odd Rogue, and that's... But even then, not now. There's enough cards in Odd Rogue, like in the 5-drop slot, that it kind of just gets outclassed again. It's more so that it just doesn't need it. And I think that's a good way of summing up the card status in Wild, really.
Yeah.
Most decently optimized decks that would think of running Dr. Boom don't need to run it because it doesn't actually do what the deck wants to do. It's a mid-range card that's good for tempo. And the best tempo deck in the proper tempo deck is Odd Rogue, and that doesn't run it because it has enough high synergy and efficient cards as well. So it's kind of a bit lost, really.
I mean, you compare it to like the 5-drops in that deck. You've got Jandis, which we've already said is just a better card at doing what Dr. Boom does. You've got Lotheb and Leroy Jenkins, which can just win the game on the spot. You've got Vilespine Slayers, which can again just win the game on the spot, or at least impact the board so it leads to that game-winning scenario much easier by killing like an Enhanced Dreadlord or a Void Lord or something like that. You've also got to consider like it's got this anti-synergy with Secret Passage. Like you say, you just don't need Dr. Boom. Like there's just really no use to have it in the deck. The deck wants to win before that point.
The other extreme, obviously, is the control decks in Wild, which is like Reno decks. And Reno decks are too synergistic and like there are higher quality cards to run than Dr. Boom. Whether you want to actually, you just want to win the game by playing Razorando in, or you want to do some disruption with Reno Lock, or there's a demon like Taunt Up. None of this fits with Dr. Boom. There's too many cards in the game at this point, and I think there's never really going to be a place for it. It's not going to see play unless it goes to some lower mana cost, which it won't. It's just in a kind of weird spot, to be honest.
Absolutely. I don't really like saying that about cards, but I think you're completely right. There's just no reason I can really foresee to actually want to run the card. It's the same thing that we said about Cairn a few episodes ago. It's just like that card that always gets cut from people's lists.
So people never thought that someone would be saying that at the time, eh? Dr. Balance and all that.
Yeah, I think that's about it, really. I think it just goes to show that like nothing is eternal in Hearthstone. Everything can change. There are no staples. Nothing lasts forever. Troggzor the Earthinator. 7 mana, 6/6. Neutral legendary. Whenever your opponent casts a spell, summon a barely rock draw Trog. I'm just going to say that again because I said rock draw for some
reason. Yeah, rock draw. You did say rock draw. Come on, mate. I believe in you.
I know. So I'm so sorry. I don't know how that happened. Whenever your opponent casts a spell, summon a barely rock draw Trog. There we go. And for those wondering what a barely rock draw...
What's it with you and drawing rocks, mate? We're not playing Scribbly.
It's a rock draw Tog.
There you go. That explains it, mate.
Stupid boy. And for those wondering what a barely rock draw Trog is, that's a 4 mana 3/5 common minion. Whenever your opponent casts a spell, gain +2 attack. So... this might be hard to believe in the year 2020, but when this card was revealed, it was very quickly hyped up to be one of the stronger cards in the game. Easily the strongest coming out of GVG, and much more so than Dr. Boom. Why was that?
Do you know what, right? I can understand why people would say that. We've spoken about the lack of 7-drops in the game at this point, and Troggzor is a pain to remove. Like, when you look at it, I think a lot of single target removal in the game at that point was a spell. You can see why people thought it would be so good, but it ends up being that a 6/6 can just get traded into, or because of the unfortunate card text, your opponent can just AoE and it gets no value. Whenever your opponent casts a spell means that it summons in between the spell being cast and the spell's effect taking place. So let's say you play Troggzor on turn 7 against a Warlock, and then on their turn 8 they play Twisting Nether. Then Troggzor will summon a Burly Rockjaw Trog, then Twisting Nether's effect will take place, and they'll both get destroyed. It ends up that it's too easy to trade into, and it's too easy to just AoE it. And it also gets farmed by Dr. Boom as well, which is another unfortunate fact. Cards that get overhyped are now called Troggzor, so that's something, isn't it?
People at the time looked at Lotheb and compared it to Lotheb and said, well, this is a extremely good card that aims to disrupt spells. This is another card that sort of serves as a curve topper that also disrupts spells. What could go wrong? But obviously, in practice, it's very easy to remove with, like you say, mass AoE, and also with something like, I don't know, trading your minions into an understated 7-drop. that's quite low tempo. Well, I say quite, it's extremely low tempo, right?
I think the issue, this is the key issue with it, is that it doesn't get immediate value, and it relies on your opponent to give it value. But otherwise, it's just the 5-drop stats, really.
It's easy to compare it to some that got released a few years later. You've got the cards from the Knights of the Frozen Throne that said, if this happens on your opponent's turn, summon this minion. So you end up with a 5-mana 2/2 that only has upside once your opponent decides to kill it. And then you think, well, they're just going to not kill it, right?
I'm just going to ignore it, yeah. I just thought of something else that you can compare it to. And Nerubian Unraveler, right?
Oh, yeah, excellent.
So if you're talking about cards that are understated and deter your opponent from, say, playing spells, Nerubian Unraveler is quite a neat example because that makes all spells cost 2 more. But that's more annoying because it's a guaranteed disruption, right?
It's not even like your opponent gets the option of playing their AoE, because it might be that this gets cheated out with, I don't know, Darkest Hour on turn 4 or 5, right? And then you see this and you think, oh, well, I can't play my Brawl now, or I can't play my Bladestorm or whatever to clear it. Whereas this at least presents you with the choice of using your AoE. At that point, there's just no comparison. As well as like Nerubian Unraveler costing 1 less mana. So there's that.
You basically have to trade into Nerubian Unraveler or take a big hit of 2 mana on a spell to remove it, which makes it an overall far scarier card than Troggzor, which is sad because I quite like Troggzor. I'm quite sure why, but...
Yeah, from me reading stuff on the internet, it's what people like in cards in Hearthstone, because it's like an interaction between your opponent and yourself, right? Unlike Lotheb, where you play Lotheb and your opponent either has to play their overcosted cards or they're just unable to. At least with Troggzor, you play this and your opponent has a choice of, well, can I handle this barely Rockjaw Trog being summoned, right? So that sort of interaction exists, and I'm not a game designer, but most people would say that that is like a healthy thing to have. It's like a dialogue between both parties. It's literally like trading value, right? Whereas Lotheb is like just not that at all. It's just hard disruption. But the problem with like Troggzor is it's too fair. It gives your opponent an option. Whereas the stuff that's actually seen play is the completely unconditional sort of disruption, like your dirty rats. If Hearthstone was populated by cards like Troggzor, where they presented this sort of interaction between both players, then maybe Troggzor would be a more playable card. But the problem is that that's not the world that we live in. We live in a world where you want to disrupt your opponent as much as possible and progress your own game plan at the same time. And you don't want to give them the luxury of being able to choose which one they want to do.
Yeah, when the extent of interaction in current Hearthstone is just like emotes and pointing your minion at the spell at the opponent's face a lot of the time.
Do you know, even though we say all this, I would still hesitate to call Trog like one of the worst legendaries, because even though it saw very little play, I still don't think it's like a terrible, terrible card. I think it's bad.
It's a perfectly reasonable card. It's like, it's playable. It's not playable technically, but you could. It's one of those ones where, like, let's say you get it off of Spiteful Summon or Evolve. You're not going to be unhappy that you get it off of Evolve, are you? It's a fine card and it's annoying to deal with, but it just doesn't quite get there, really.
It's got the Deathwing problem where you just don't want to put it in a deck, right?
Absolutely.
Obviously, like, the main lesson people have sort of learnt from this is if something requires your opponent to do something very particular for it to actually gain value, it might not be as good as it looks. I wonder if this card could have been made a 6-mana 6/6 and it, see play, because at that point it's like you're not paying that much of a premium.
Yeah.
It'd probably see play at that point, right? I don't know.
But at the time, maybe. I don't know what it'd need, really. Give it stealth. There you go. That's a fun solution to the problem.
Everyone loves stealth.
Exactly. Just make it so your opponent can't target it or trade into it. Now that's interactivity.
Gazlowe. 6-mana 3/6 neutral legendary. Whenever you cast a 1-mana spell, add a random mech to your hand. This is an interesting card. Obviously designed to synergize with the spare parts mechanic, and these are cheap 1-mana spells that you find off of like little incidental effects in GVG.
They're like tokens that come off of otherwise decent units, like Clockwork Nomad, 1 mana, 2/1 mech, Deathwell at the spare part, Mechanical Yeti, which is just a Yeti that adds a spare part to each player's hand, just like tokens that are on all usually okay cards in themselves.
And obviously, you can just run 1 mana spells in your deck, like Naturalize and Lesser Jasper Spellstone and that sort of thing. So, the first thing to say about Gazlowe is its stats are terrible. Like, really bad.
Really terrible.
Oh, boy.
This is one of the weirdest cards, I think, in the game, honestly. It's like such a specific, weird effect that gives a weird payoff as well. I don't have a problem with Gazlowe, but my God, it's terrible. That 6 mana 3/6 is, it's atrocious stat line. And even if you cast, say, 2 1-mana spells with it, drawing 2 random mechs, even at the time, wasn't good. Gazlowe is just a weird value engine with no real actual use, as far as I know. I don't know what deck actually wants this sort of thing, really.
Do you want me to tell you, like, the history of this card in competitive play? Because I've done quite a bit of research into this and, like, trying to find what people have actually done. Do you want me to tell you about it?
Sort of a bit of playing priest, maybe?
So, like, there's a deck that Crypt made with it in.
Right, yeah.
That is the extent to which I could find decks with Gazlowe in them. You're going to struggle to find a use for this card. Compare it to Gadgets and Auctioneer, right?
Ooh.
That's a card with even worse stats and is far, far better than this card.
Yeah.
Another 6 mana card, but it synergizes with your 1 mana spells, it synergizes with your 0 mana spells. It's great. And it actually gives you cards from your deck which you would want rather than random mechs, which, as Jamie has alluded to, are usually terrible. I mean, the one time that random mechs have ever actually been good is off of Omega Assembly. The 1 mana warrior spell that when you're at 10 mana crystals gives you 3 random mechs, and before then you just discover a mech. And off of the Dr. Boom Mad Genius Hero Power delivery drone.
At which point they have Rush as well, which...
Those are the times where random mechs have been good. Both of those instances have been much more efficient and effective than Gazlowe, where you have a severe deck build around cost, right? Having to run 1 mana spells and save them for Gazlowe, and having to play Gazlowe on a turn where it's quite late in the game and you're not going to just die to like the opponent's board presence by playing this severely understated minion and lots of like low impact cards. It kind of screams of like the team was still trying to figure out what they could and couldn't print, right?
Yeah, it's an attempt at giving sort of like a big, flashy value card, but it just ends up being a bit flat, really. Well, you're talking about comparisons, but compare this to Archmage Antonidas. I think a Fireball is better than a random mech most of the time.
I think you wouldn't be wrong there.
Honestly, the effect would actually be okay, but it costs 6. Even if it was reasonably statted for 6, it's still too much, really. If it was 4 mana for a 3/6, I don't think it would be overpowered at all nowadays.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be too good back in the day because 4 mana 3/6 is a bit over the top, but like the effect's interesting enough. I would try it if it was better costed. I mean, the other problem you have to think is that you have to have 1 mana spells aren't cards that you'd want to play a lot of in the deck, because if you draw them in the late game, they're not generally good. And whilst Gazlowe's a good way of using 1 mana spells to like generate stuff, it's still not something you want to play.
A lot of these early random effects are, suboptimal stuff triggered by suboptimal stuff to generate suboptimal stuff. And obviously, like, overall, it generates you a lot more stats than just including, like, a big thing new deck. But it's really, really conditional and slow and tedious to do. So that's kind of the reason why that sort of design has been phased out, I think. Flame Leviathan. 7 mana, 7/7 mage legendary mech. When you draw this, deal 2 damage to all characters. I'll start because on the Hearthstone wiki, we look at the notes and it says, when Gnomish Experimenter draws Flame Leviathan, first Flame Leviathan's effect goes off, then the card is transformed into a chicken. So if you wanted to know that.
That's what we need to say about it, really. James is a massive fan of this card for everybody listening. I only have one thing to say about this card.
Go on, Jamie.
Why? There is no reason for this. At some point in the game, I'm going to randomly just blow everything up. So I have no idea whether I'm going to have a big board Like, oh, it may AoE my opponent's blood, but I might have a big board of tokens and stuff. Oh, I'm just going to blow it all up and reveal to my opponent a card I've got in my hand for no reason. It's not even like it's particularly overstated. 7 mana for 7/7's fine, but why not just play Dr. Boom if you want a 7-drop?
Well, I think the argument behind this card being designed, right, would be, well, it's not a 7-drop. It's 0 mana, deal 2 to everything, right? But the problem is it's 0 mana, deal 2 to everything, which you can't control when you draw. This is not a card that I see very often. In fact, I can barely even remember its opening line, okay? Flame Leviathan is like what a lot of people would call bad RNG. Like Jamie says, you could have an entire board of minions and then it just gets blown up. Your opponent could have an entire board of minions and then you never draw Flame Leviathan. Or you draw Flame Leviathan on turn 1, so its effect is completely moot. So it's inconsistent, right? We know that. But then you've got to start thinking like, well, what sort of deck would actually want this sort of effect? And it's going to be a deck which is like never on board, because otherwise it's going to be a detriment. And you've got like a 7 mana 7/7 in your hand, which you don't want to play because it's poor tempo. So then you've got to start thinking, well, what mage deck never ever wants to be on the board? And the answer is like none of them. Like even the hardest, most off the board control deck wants to be on the board sometimes. And that suffers from Flame Leviathan as well. This isn't even mentioning the fact that once you draw Flame Leviathan, it damages your face as well. You might have your ice block popped at 1, and then you draw Flame Leviathan. And this has happened to me from playing like Prince Malchezaar in decks and stuff like that, and not realizing there's a Flame Leviathan in my deck, and then I draw it and it kills me. And I think, well, great.
I was going to talk about bad RNG, and that's completely correct in this case, because it's going to feel bad a lot of the time either way. Because then you're going to spend the whole game hoping for it and you're not going to draw it, or you're going to draw it on an empty board, it's going to do nothing, or you're going to draw it when you're ahead and you're going to blow up your own stuff. And then there's the fact that it gives your opponent card information so that they can play around less stuff because they know you've got a trash 7/7 in the hand that does nothing. Sure, they were experimenting with like on-draw effect and all that, but even then, it's just such a poor implementation of that concept because it's so trash. A pile of stats that does nothing on the board. There you go. I've used my buzzwords.
I'm going to start playing Jamie Bingo when we're doing it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had to play. I've got to play to it at that time.
It's kind of interesting that this is like the first legendary that they give it after Antoniadis, which is a little weird to think about because it's kind of like an often forgotten card. So I don't know.
You've said this before, but it doesn't synergize with anything or have an identity with anything. You can't build a deck around it. It doesn't really help with any strategy. They essentially just had a waste of a card slot.
Bolvar Fordragon, 5 mana, 1/7 Paladin legendary. Whenever a friendly minion dies while this is in your hand, gain +1 attack. Cards that upgrade themselves in the hand, but based on what's happening. So we've got Bolvar, we've got Blubber Baron. What else have we got? We've got quite a few, right?
I mean, it's not the best. There are very few that actually have been even close to playable. Like you say, Blubber Baron, which is atrocious. Jumbo Imp's another one. That's also rubbish and seen no play. Blood Herald from the new set. And that's never been played, I don't think, ever. Blood Herald's the worst card in the set, so in my opinion. So you get where I'm going with this, really.
What's an example of a card that's good that gets upgraded in your hand?
Right, well, so the best example, obviously, to anybody who played in the format is Corridor Creeper. Well, hey.
Hooray.
As of now, it's a 7 mana 2/5 beast. Costs 1 less whenever a minion dies while this is in your hand. Key thing about Corridor Creeper is that it's whenever any minion dies, so it goes from both sides, which means that it very quickly gets reduced. Now, when it was originally a 5/5, it was in basically every deck in the game. In terms of warping, it's just unbelievable, frankly. It's cost reduction as opposed to stats. All the other ones are stats, and they're all terrible.
That is quite major. It's the reason that Devout Pupil sees playing like Librum Paladin right now, right?
Yeah.
I think I'm seeing a trend here that unless they are Corridor Creeper, these cards are all kind of crap. So what about Bolvar then?
I think the problem with Bolvar is that Number one, he's an absolutely shocking top deck for obvious reasons.
Yes.
Number two, it's whenever a friendly minion dies, so it's only on your side, which makes it quite hard to rack up unless you're playing heavy tokens. Three, for Bolvar to get enough attack to make it a big threat will take a while, and then it'll just get removed. Let's say you wait until the late game and make it, so it's like a 15 attack or something. If they've like a Dr. Boom, they can just trade into it. Or if they've got a big game hunter, they can just kill it. Simply put, it's too frail for not enough of a payoff. For it to actually be good, it'd have to have like charge or stealth or something stupid so it can actually guaranteed get an effect.
It's really, really hard for this card to both be played on curve where it's most effective and have lots of stats, or played in the late game when it's got time to get loads of stats, but also be effective. Like Jamie says, it needs stealth or something like that. Bolvar is just, as we keep saying, it's just a big pile of stats and it doesn't do anything on the board.
We need to get some pile of stats merch.
We really do.
Get it on a mug, get on a t-shirt.
Absolutely.
It's a pile of stats that's hard to turn into a pile of stats, and then it just gets silenced, bounced, or removed, and it just...
The ideal deck for this does kind of exist in Wild at the moment, and that is Odd Paladin, a deck where you summon lots and lots of tokens. But the problem is, like, Bolvar encourages you to trade all of your tokens in.
Yeah, it does, which isn't what you want to do.
Yeah, exactly. You want to save the Silverhand recruits so they can get buffed by the side quest or Quartermaster or something like that. And Bolvar obviously doesn't really want you to do that. It wants you to trade them all in so you can play a bit of a crap 5-drop.
Yeah, and at which point there's a card called Blessing of Authority, which is a +8/+8.
My understanding of it is it's like the flavour of it is the fact that it is friendly minions. It's not like Corridor Creeper where it's just other minions, but that is kind of the way that you'd save the card, is if it was all minions that died. And at that point, it might actually be quite playable, but not like this.
I'll tell you something I do like about Bolvar.
Go on.
His entrance is fantastic.
Oh, yeah, definitely, definitely.
Bolvar is well up there, especially the fact that the lion thing gets bigger, the higher its attack is. Good music as well. It's all around.
I think you appreciate it a little bit more as well because you never really see it.
Yeah.
I think that just about wraps it up for this episode, unless you've got anything else burning that you want to say to our lovely audience. But I think that's just about it. I think we've covered those cards rather.
I think that covers it.
Yeah. Stay safe, everyone. We'll see you in the next episode. That's goodbye from me.
Well, that's goodbye from me. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Stay safe. Oh, that was a good one. That was a fun one to do.